I'm Warren Siemens, former director of the MIT Museum. We're here today to talk about the history of women and how that history has developed over the years, particularly the last 50 years at MIT. Roz?
I'm Rosalind Williams, now the Dean for Undergraduate Education and Student Affairs, and have been for 2 years at MIT. I have many deep memories of MIT going back to the 50s as a kid whose family was at MIT. So I'm both participating as an individual with that background and also as dean. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Emily Wick. I came to MIT as a graduate student in 1946 to study organic chemistry. And that was right after World War II, and everybody, all the grad students, everyone, all the guys could hardly believe they were still alive. But they were, and it was a wonderful time to be here. And also everyone remembered all the wonderful things MIT had done during the war. You know, it was the national resource, and everyone was proud to be part of it. I got my PhD and then postdoced until '53. Then I worked at Arthur D. Little for 4 years, and then I came back to MIT, this time in the food technology department as a research associate. And in a couple years I was appointed assistant professor and worked like crazy because at that time there was an age limit when you would become no longer eligible to even be considered tenure. And I had about 2 years to go. So, but I worked real hard, and I was fortunate in having some wonderful graduate students who made it all possible, and some postdocs. And so I got promoted and got tenure. Soon after I did that, Kenneth Wadley, who was the Dean of Student Affairs at that time, wandered down to my lab. And he said, you know, there are not many of you girls around here on the faculty. And there were 2 of us, myself and Margaret Freeman in the Foreign Languages department. And Ken Wadley knew that Mrs. McCormick, at that time, this was about 1963 by now, the first part of McCormick Hall was built, and the number of women students had increased considerably, but Ken knew that Mrs. McCormick was going to give money for a second wing of McCormick Hall, and there would be many more, significantly more women students. And so he said, how about coming half-time to the dean's office and being an associate dean of student affairs with primary responsibility for women students across the whole range of student affairs. So that's when I moved up the dean's office and met Dottie, who was already there, understanding all the students and the way the system worked and how the departments worked and what was going on.
Well, I'm Dorothy Bowe, and I came to MIT in 1950 to work in the metallurgy department, where I worked with graduate students. My professor, Norton, was about to retire, and so I knew a lot of women students, mostly because my office was on the main corridor. And lots of people dropped in to see me. I had always ran a very open office. The door was always open and anybody could come in. Dr. Compton always came in on his way to lunch and to say hello and how are things going today, which I always will remember. He had lovely blue eyes. Anyway, a lot of women students at the time were not doing well academically and were feeling that if the environment was better, that we might, that they might do better and become part of the mainstream of the Institute, which at the time they felt that that wasn't happening for them. Because Mrs. McCormick's money was becoming available for a dormitory, Ken had decided that it would be a good idea to have someone on his staff who could oversee the environment for students and the new housing, and in fact women students across the board at MIT. And he went to talk to Polly Bunting at Radcliffe about this to get some ideas, and she suggested that he hired Jacqueline Matfeld to come down and do a complete research project from a history and write a program for women students at MIT, and which she did. And her second year at MIT, I was asked to come down and work with her because she was new to the Institute and didn't know who to contact about what and where to get different bits of information, which I was able to do. So I worked with her for, I think, about a year and a half when she put together this program, which was a wonderful, really, really hard-working person who put together an awful lot of information. And it caused a great deal of discussion, both pro and con, but was certainly an important document and something that I think has laid the groundwork for what went on since that time. Jackie was then offered a position at Sarah Lawrence College and left to become, I believe, the dean there. And that's when Emily was invited to come down. I wasn't sure Emily would want to keep me on because I had done a lot of this background work, and as I said, some of it was controversial, and I figured someone new will want to bring in their own staff and lay it out. And I knew she had background at MIT, so that what I was doing wasn't always necessary. But anyway, she did ask me to stay. It was the beginning, I think, of an absolutely remarkable relationship. We worked together as a team, right? What Emily did very well, I didn't do very well, and the other way around. Mm-hmm. We got to know all the students, really, every student. We really worked very hard to identify each person by name, make sure that the office was always open, and that no woman student felt that there was nowhere that they could go if they needed even a simple question answered. We did administer housing, athletics, just about every mm-hmm. possible student issue came through our office. In fact, a lot of men students came to our office for the same variety of issues. But as time went on and Ken left that job, I had been there 7 years, and I decided it was probably time for me to move on as well, which left Emily there, and she left shortly after that. In that gap time, we felt something needed to be filled in. We needed a fill-in for the time that we were there, and Millie had come on board during that time as the Abby Rockefeller Mosé professor, and we were able to include her in many of the things that we did, and I will turn it over to her from there.
She took the ball.
She took the ball.
Well, I actually came to MIT before this time, but I was at Lincoln Lab starting in June 1960, and was many years before we met, at least 7. And I came to Lincoln Lab because it was absolutely first-class research lab. And I had a family problem because there was husband and wife, that's 2 members of the same family, both in science, in similar fields, in fact. And I was a postdoc at Cornell University, where my husband, Gene Dresselhaus, was a faculty member. But that time, that 1960, there were nepotism rules. And so as long as I was a postdoc with my own support, it was fine for me to be there. But when the NSF postdoc fellowship came to an end, that was the end of my appointment. And there wasn't even an opportunity to work for nothing. So Ithaca, New York is sort of the end of the world. There was no industry, there was no other thing. That was just it. And so we were looking around for a place we could both work, and there were just two places that were willing to take two people in the same field. And MIT was one of them. IBM Corporation was the other one. So we had a choice of, individually we could go to all kinds of places, but together we had very limited choice. And we decided we didn't want to have a traveling marriage. So that's how we came to Lincoln Lab. And not only that they hired the two of us, but they encouraged us to interact strongly and write papers together and all kinds of things that were kind of against the rules of that particular period in time. Lincoln Lab was a wonderful place to work. I had a kind of a job there that allowed me to do research on most anything I was interested in. And those kinds of jobs just don't exist today. So to young people, it's almost impossible to describe this opportunity. And it was a great opportunity, except for the fact I was a female. And as the number of children that we had increased, conforming to the hours requirement that they had became more and more impossible. And the particular thing that led to my difficulties in coming down to MIT campus was the rule that we had to report for work at 8 o'clock in the morning. And as the number of children increased, this became more and more difficult. And I was always late, and I got an awful lot of flack. There were two of us that were in this situation. We seemed to have our babies 9 months phased between us. So there was always somebody with a new baby between the two of us. The other person was Laura Roth, who is a brilliant solid-state theorist. And she was the one that got fed up with the harassment first, and she left for Tufts University to take a faculty position there. And so with one of us gone, the brunt of the criticism fell on me. And after a while, I got so that I couldn't take it anymore also. So I was looking for something to do. And at that time, I became aware of the Appy Rockefeller Mosaic Chair, which had just been founded.
Right.
And I applied, or somebody applied for me, of course. That was, I guess, a more accurate description. And I was offered this visiting position, which I accepted, and turned into a permanent position very shortly after I arrived. So that's how I came to MIT, is a very circuitous and different path. And it was several years later, in 1973, when I became the permanent holder of that chair, which was a very, very nice chair. Because it gave me quite a bit of resources and freedom. But at any rate, when I first arrived, it's important to mention this this chair, because the chair had one of the conditions about the chair was scholarship for women. It was for women scholars to promote female scholarship, or the scholarship of women scientists and engineers. So in reading the scriptures on the subject, it became clear that I should find out whether there were implications a bit in a broader sense if I was supposed to do something for the female students on campus. So at that point, very early on, I made contact with Emily, I suppose, first, and you couldn't meet Emily at that time without meeting Dottie. So they were sort of like two twins. So that's how I got to know them both. They each had played quite a different role in implementing women's issues and activities on campus. And they made it clear to me that not only even though there was no stipulation within the chair that I had to do any particular thing on behalf of women, they certainly would welcome any help I could offer, because there was so much work to be done, and it was far beyond what they could do, and having a third person would both make it fun and increase our effectiveness by a factor of 2, something like that. They say it would be a multiplication factor by the additional ideas that we could bring to bear and discuss. And it really turned out that way, I think, that we energized each other a great deal. And on days when we could be discouraged, we found ways to be encouraged. Yeah. So our relationship started in 1967 and was very intense until Emily left, and we will recount to you some of the things that happened during those years.
Could we go back and talk, you mentioned, Dottie, about the number of, you knew every woman student by name and so forth. What was the women student population that you could do this service to?
There were about 100 in a class at that time, if I remember right, or somewhere in that.
And a class how big was a class?
It was about 800 in a total class,
yes.
I think.
How do you like the number 372?
Sounds very close to 100 in a class, yeah.
For the total undergraduate?
That's a number that sticks in my mind for some reason. I don't know what it
sounds
means.
Good because I'm thinking of 100 in a class, and with the attrition and it sounds about right.
10%.
So yes.
And
Yes.
would you,
Yep.
how about graduate students? Were you also involved?
Again, our door was open and we saw many graduate students. The fact that Emily had been a graduate student and was a faculty member and had graduate students of her own did increase the number.
Graduate students, if they're in a department that cares about graduate students, and if their professor runs a place where there's a home-like atmosphere, then they've got a home already. And it wasn't until you want to do something on a more institute-wide basis or you needed a little outside help.
I'm thinking in particular that Millie had meetings in Cheney Room.
Yeah.
You know, that was one of the first things that we tried, and the reason it had a purpose. That was partly to educate me on the milieu, that is the local climate, and to meet with the students without anybody else. I just did it more or less myself. I think you came once in a while to stop and check up on me. But this was a personal exchange to educate me about what the issues were and to try to come to setting some priorities about where to put our time and trying to improve things.
Were these regular scheduled meetings, or were they just sort of?
Yeah, they were, and I guess that most of the kinds of issues that came up were that we had a group of students. It was clear that they were academically very gifted, but they had some difficulty getting through the system, and it wasn't related to academics, but was climate related. And they had, each and every one of them, it seemed, had general concerns about, that they had low aspirations, they had confidence problems, they felt that the professors didn't pay attention to their questions in class, and it went on and on in this way.
And these are particularly gender related.
The issues that were brought up were almost entirely gender related, and this was the only way I could get into these issues, because the classes that I taught, for the most part, were all male. Because my department had essentially almost no women, had a very, very small percentage, much smaller than the Institute as a whole. Electrical engineering was kind of behind some of the other departments in attracting women, although I think that they made some effort They
Yes.
pointed me,
Yes.
and they pointed other
That's right.
faculty
That's right.
fairly early on. But where the students had to select the department, it took some time. So
That group of students was both graduate and undergraduate who came to talk with you. I think they really, I mean, that was my first.
we fed them.
That's right.
We had them cookies and tea.
Always the magic
That's
bait.
right. But Emily, Emily knew a lot of students, and we encouraged them to use Cheney Room, which she had used as a
Yeah,
student.
oh, it was an oasis.
It was an
It was
oasis.
the oasis
It was a
in the
place to
40s.
get away if things weren't going well, and then having Millie there was just an added, a plus because
I
she
think
was
this
there
raises a
talking.
point, and to cover this early history, early 40s, 50s history. What was the living situation for women students? And
Well, when I came, it was the second year that 120 Bay State Road had been opened. And it was a nice house over there in Boston, and I think the capacity was 18. And half of us were grad students and half undergrad. And Margaret Alvord, whose husband had taught at Tufts, was the manager, and she was a good friend. Mrs. Compton was very much involved, and Mrs. Sage in that house. Mrs. McCormick, there was a special fund Mrs. McCormick gave that allowed you could hire a taxi on torrential rain days. You didn't have to walk the bridge. Mrs. Alvord used to go to the Friday afternoon Boston Symphony concerts with Mrs. McCormick. And so we didn't see much of Mrs. McCormick, but we knew her presence was there. And of course, she was the class of 1902,
Four.
and she, well, I think Mrs. Alvord, Mrs. Compton, the Killians, they knew Mrs. McCormick cared about women students.
But wasn't there a restriction on the number of women students based upon the number of housing spaces that were available?
Yeah. I don't know whether in the 40s, whether they really cared where you lived. That's why I think there weren't very many women who came as undergrads. And then the other thing to set the environment is that, we talk about how we tried to know every woman student. And in today's context, that almost sounds like we were babying them. Well, that wasn't true. We were trying to nourish this little small, it's like a little plant, surrounded by this big environment, which everyone really, love is not the right word, but you're stimulated by. It's so exciting, just the learning, the information, the wonderful people walking around on the campus that have done all these things in science and technology. But it was just such a small group of women. And then the Margaret Cheney Room, I remember when I was a grad student, when I first came, I had gone to Mount Holyoke and graduated in 1943 in a liberal arts college, and we had real good science, and we worked real hard. You come to MIT, and I used to think, those poor undergraduates, there's no way to live. And but you get into the atmosphere, and you become part of a group in your department. And then if the system doesn't break you into little bits, you're going to succeed. But if it does bust you up, that's the sad part. And I could never have survived it as an undergraduate. I wasn't that professionally driven. I would have probably done something else. I probably wouldn't have majored in it.
Were there women or alumni when you were a graduate student that were particularly inspirational to you, that you came to know? Or what gave you the force to go on?
Catherine Hazen, who had also gone to Mount Holyoke some years before me, had gotten her master's at MIT. There were ladies.
These people
there
were taking
these
an active
ladies,
part.
they were around, and they paid attention.
These were, Catherine Hazen was a good example of someone also we called on.
Oh, yeah, and of
on
course her
occasion
husband was Harold
because,
Hazen.
he was here as a faculty member, and she
Yeah.
was knowledgeable
Yeah.
about the Institute, and she was not a shrinking violet. She,
Oh,
Isn't today?
she wouldn't know.
and Margaret Compton, I mean, with all that college, Worcester and everything in the Compton family, she was a wonderful lady right there to, you know, give a little moral support or you know, say, well, that's not the right attitude. But
When you came as a graduate student, then did you find that the department was a home for you in the way that you say?
Yes.
If that works,
yeah, it was a,
it
it was
works
a good
well.
gang of people, and I think a lot of it was that it was right after World War II, and there was a special atmosphere around
Yeah,
here.
it was different.
A special
how
atmosphere.
How is it different?
Well, it was because, you know, the war was really a terrible thing to be living through. And you'd, while it was going on, you'd go home at night or you'd read the paper. You didn't know about what your best friend or your brother or your fiance or whoever, you know, they weren't alive anymore. It was awful time. And to have all that over and to have Europe kind of, well, the Marshall Plan and things were, you know, beginning to come back together in Europe and around the world. It was a time of...
But MIT had a family relation.
Oh,
We did
yes.
so much to win the war.
Absolutely.
And
so you were so proud to be here.
And particularly in my department,
Yes.
that there was a real bondship between people.
Oh,
and it was,
yes.
You
As
know,
if
they,
they'd served in the army together.
Well, they
Yeah.
had
Oh,
the
yeah.
ideas, the radar and
radar was
everything.
born here.
Yeah.
And people that were in radar, so many of them went to Los Alamos and other
Right.
places
Oh,
to
absolutely.
work on the Manhattan Project
Right.
and so forth. So, and then they came back here. So they had an inside track.
Yeah, and a kind of deep wisdom and seasoning. I mean, those people that I'll
It was
never
ki-
forget when
it was a
Oppenheimer
club.
came and gave a seminar and talked. The look on that guy's face, you just, you know, he'd lived and.
There was a group when I was in metallurgy department, for instance, who never thought they would ever attend a university.
That's right.
That's the other thing.
These
That's
people
the other
who
thing.
came, you know, with the GI and
That
super
was it.
bright, super capable, very committed, but mature and
Yeah.
knowing what they wanted to do. And I think that was a very special
Yes.
group of people that I think
Yes.
you're both referring to.
But Emily, we don't, when we think of the GI Bill, we don't think of women students coming in under that.
Well, the women students didn't come into the GI
So-
Bill. In fact, well, I don't think too many women grad students. Well,
Well,
I
did-
have
did-
a true confession. The reason I came to MIT was it was near the Atlantic Ocean, and I love to sail. And if I was
Now
going
we
to
do.
work like crazy, I would rather come to a place near the ocean where I could sail. Otherwise, I would have gone to the University of Illinois, where Roger Adams and a lot of very famous organic chemists had been there. So I wasn't exactly professionally driven.
But were you,
Reasonable, right?
were there other women students in that, in your grad class?
Yes, the other women grad students at that time, there weren't a lot of us, but I worked in Dr. Cope's group, Arthur Cope. He was head of the department for many years and a very distinguished chemist and very, very fine, nice, absolute integrity. I learned more about, I mean, nowadays I read in the newspapers about, you know, people accuse scientists of fudging results and this and that. Dr. Cope made sure, and it didn't enter our heads, that you would ever put in your research notebook something that you didn't observe. I mean, whether it was a big blot of coffee that you spilled or, but it was wonderful training. Just wonderful.
Let's follow that a little bit, though, because I think Ken Wadley was one of those people
Absolutely.
Well, was he from
who came at that time in
Around
engineering through.
the mid-century.
Yes,
He's the same age as I. He was
Yeah, he
class
came in
of
43.
Right,
at MIT.
and had been in the service, I
service.
believe, and was one of those people who didn't expect to be at a university
Yeah.
like
Right.
this. And I can recall one time when we were talking about what his expectations were for women students, and he said, I want it to be a first-class place for women students, just as it is for men. And that's, you know, a goal that you should keep in mind when you're looking at any part of what he called across-the-board issues,
Yeah.
was that we should be considering it as making it a first-class place for
So
women.
he became Dean for Student Affairs in
When-
63, something like
No, before that.
It must have been around 59 or 60,
Yes.
because I went down there, I think, in
He'd
62.
been in the mechanical engineering department. And,
Yeah, and was I think he had won the Ballard Award or one of the
Yes.
awards for teaching,
Right.
whatever, and had come to Dr. Stratton's attention in that route. And again, Dr. Stratton was influential because he had 3 daughters, I think, and
Yes.
and
Yes,
had
that's right.
and also had the contact with Mrs. McCormick, and all of this kind of came together at the time. I think Mrs. Stratton, we talked a little bit about her role, and one thing I remember about her, she was the first president's wife who ever invited non-faculty, non-student women to participate in anything.
Yeah.
And she had invited me and Alice and a number of other people to come to a discussion group of some kind at the president's house, where we talked about what it was like to be a woman at MIT. And I think that was the first time in my time at the Institute that anybody in that kind of a position had brought it up. So
Do you think it was a conscious decision on somebody like Ken Wadley's or Jay Stratton's part to increase the number, to make it more
well, I think cared about
Affable.
excellence in education, and they figured that women were as, you know, as human as fellows, and they deserved any.
It wasn't my impression that they were after increase in numbers rather
Not
than
particularly.
increase in the
Quality.
of life for
Life.
the students that were there. I believe even when I came, and that was a few years after the time we're talking about here, we didn't have expectations of large numbers. And I remember once doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation, thinking that by the time I would retire, we would be up to 20%.
Yes.
That was kind of the
30s and 40%,
kind of outer limit of attainability.
Yeah.
So
But why were you even think, if you think there was a drive to increase to some degree, but within a limit? Or, I mean, why was this 20% sort of?
well,
that?
in our anecdotal contacts with the women students, it was just a question of interest. The ones that we had basically gave us the impression that it was pretty hard to make your way, even as a student, let alone as a career, in the fields that we feature here at the Institute. So that's one factor. And then it was felt that women just weren't interested. So there was both the bias and the reality of the difficulty in making your way through this place or any other like institution and then establishing a career.
The other thing is,
And there was no history of it.
Yeah.
The numbers in
Yeah.
the profession
Yeah,
were
nothing.
so
and also
small.
since those times in the 60s, the whole curriculum at MIT has changed. I mean, look at the required courses, and I haven't been close enough to it to be able to speak of it in detail, but there are many more fields that are not just strictly the straight-ahead engineering and pure science that back when I was a grad student or even in the 60s was the norm.
The core has been cut in half in the
Yeah.
60s, and the other thing that's happened is women are heading for specific majors. I mean, chemical engineering is now, or has been, over half women.
Right.
And of course, biology has
Right,
got an
yes.
enormous amount of women, and there's a sort of biomedical
Right.
combination or bioengineering.
But on the other hand, women have gone over critical mass in every single
Absolutely.
department.
Right.
So it's not that's not really the whole story. And in the early work that we were involved with, say just around 1970, we made some conscious efforts at that time we had I guess we'll get to this later, our grant from the Carnegie Foundation.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that would, one of the main points about that grant was to set some priorities for women on campus, and I think that we put very strong emphasis to get women in the mainstream of MIT, not out on the peripheries, but have them study the same thing that the men. Because a very simple calculation would show that an institution has some strength in various areas of science and technology, and how do you see that? You see that in terms of the faculty appointments. And if the women students would go one way and the men students would go in another way, that would limit how many women that you could ever have, and it would be a very undesirable situation. So we orchestrated our grant in a way to promote women's participation in fields where they hadn't been before.
The other thing we should say is that
We'll talk about
for
that
many
later.
years,
I think it's going to come up.
the number of women students that were admitted was governed by the number of dormitory, with the
That would be a
dormitory
good thing to talk
space.
about now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah, I think it's-
that's a critical thing to
That's
cover
very
at this
critical
point during the 60s, I believe.
because it meant that you filled the spaces that were available for women. There was a residence rule.
Yeah.
Do we
if
know when
you-
that actually came in? Was it existing when you moved to the dean's office, Dottie?
Oh, yeah.
I think so. Yes, there was a residence rule for women students at that time, but that was
So sometime in the 50s.
First tower at
Yeah, that
McCormick
came
had
with
been.
the first half
I
of
think it came
McCormick.
with the.
And
So
what was
prior
the
to that
rule
time, it wasn't.
exactly, just so-
That a woman student, unless she lived with her family, was required to live on campus. Now, at the time, there was no way, there wasn't enough space at all for the men's students. I mean, they could never have applied that rule to the men's students. But it was part of, from the point of view of
Safety, maybe.
improving the quality of life
Yes. Yes.
of the women students. But it did put a
Limiting.
Right.
limit on the numbers.
And it did appear to be biased in the sense that, and remember, we had a group of women students who got very, very upset with this and went to Ken Wadley to accuse Emily of being unfair to women students by applying this rule or including this rule. And I've forgotten now what it was resolved without too much difficulty, whatever. But the student brought in a jar of apple butter to Ken. I don't know if you remember that.
Vaguely remember that. But
And we said, we didn't get any apple butter, but he got it.
So when McCormick was built, then it made a huge difference because all of a sudden
it made
the
all the difference in the world. Because smart young women who might have been attracted by MIT, but that wasn't, I mean, the living conditions were just crummy. And you didn't really have a chance at athletics or the whole range of
on campus
I was going to
activities.
ask about that.
So you know, why not?
Why?
And at the same time, of course, the former men's colleges were going co-ed, so they could go anywhere. Able young women could. And then it came along that, the second part of McCormick got built, and that meant the numbers just went right up. This was before any thought of affirmative action, or thinking of, you know, goals and timetables. This is prehistory to that.
So how did admissions work at that point?
Well, I used to read about 250 folders. I'd read all the women's folders, and I'd read some men's too to
Get
keep
calibrated.
calibrated,
Yeah.
to know, well, you know, is this all different? And so we were always part of the admissions.
But women's admissions were handled separately as a
Yeah, I
separate
think,
thing.
yes.
Up until I think your report.
Yeah, I think so. And then
And
we
then,
recommended,
yeah.
as the dorms here began to go co-ed, Student House went co-ed, and we could anticipate that women would be infiltrating the residence system,
Right.
as well as there'd be McCormick for people who didn't want the co-ed.
Yeah.
experience. So it was then the numbers could even grow more. In the outside world, the whole culture was changing so rapidly that
But
just all.
what the report established was equal criteria for
Yes,
men and women,
yes,
which was
yes.
very important.
Yes.
And then a corollary of that, if you have equal requirements, why not have the same admission process?
Right.
So
right.
the same admission process, I think, happened before 1970.
I think so.
About 68 or
Yes.
69, something
Yeah.
around in there.
Actually, there are two things here that probably need to be said. Emily's report has a very significant information in it, which I think can be used for
Yeah, the numbers.
a number of things. And it indicates what the quality of life for women students was before McCormick and after McCormick. Academics changed and went up. The whole participation and a variety of on-campus things all made this dramatic change the minute you saw this on-campus support system, so to speak.
And a larger number of women.
Women, the numbers
around.
increased, and the whole thing just takes on a very different, a different view of what happens to women students when they were here. The next thing is, though, that Millie then became a member of the committee.
And you just
And
cataloged.
she just picked up from there.
I was involved with that original report.
Yes, you were.
Yes.
And there were some aspects about that were important. Many men felt that the prospect, the potential of good students was quite limited.
Yes.
And that the numbers that we had would be limited by the cutoff. We had one cutoff for men and another cutoff for women. Women had much higher qualification.
Right, at the cutoff.
And it was felt that once that was equalized, that would be the number. And that was a very small number.
Yeah.
In actuality. So, however, what they didn't take into account was that once people became aware that we were interested in having women students and offering equal access, and we were one of the first few schools that had equal access
That's
at
right.
the time that we did this. The numbers shot up far beyond any expectations. And not only that, but the quality of the applicants also went up, and this surprised the men greatly.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
But
Surprised me too.
You were a member of the committee at that time, the admissions committee.
Oh, yes.
You were
able to.
I was working on that for a few years, a couple of years before our report, and that sort of led, I think that we were working together on this led to courage to come up with this report.
You know, I think I did one, and then as I left, you
Yes,
and
she did.
Paula Stone and a whole bunch of people worked on
Oh, that was a
another one.
different report.
Yeah, okay,
That was a different
right.
report.
But you
That
really
report
carried
wasn't
it
about the original admissions report we did.
Yeah, right. Okay.
We did that
Do you
one.
remember the date of the one you're talking about?
1968.
Really?
It was the first one.
The first report. And the second report with all these other people was 1970.
Yeah.
And that started because of the demise of your office, Emily.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what brought it about. And there were two things that happened as a result of the demise of your office that happened very abruptly. Remember, one day it was, and the next day it wasn't.
The demise.
Maybe you could explain what happened about that
I don't know
better
that we
than.
know, do we?
No, I knew that I needed to go back, and if I wanted to have any credibility as a scientist, I had to get back there and do something. Then, no sooner than I got back to the department than Mount Holyoke came wondering if I would be interested in being the dean of faculty. And I never thought I'd ever leave MIT. In fact, I told the faculty member on the search committee who called me, and it was an old friend of mine. I said, "Oh, Tibby, forget it. I live where I want to live, and I love it here. Don't bother me." Well, then I sat down again, and I thought, in all my experience at MIT, and during the Vietnam troubles and the divestment of the Draper lab, because of my half-time position as dean, got me invited to meetings, kind of across campus meetings, where you'd learn about what was going on and how people like, oh gosh, Jerry Wiesner and Paul Gray and all the people who had the whole burden of the Institute on them were dealing with this. And I had become very interested in educational institutions and how they worked, and I'd also become very much interested in women's education. So I said to the search committee person, I called her back, I said, I don't want the job, but if you folks want to waste your time, I'd love to come out and find out how Mount Holyoke works. So I went out, and you know, it was fascinating. And I never expected I'd be the candidate. But then when I ended up being the candidate and Mr. David Truman was the president, I mean, it was a challenge I was ready for. And a smaller institution on a scale that you can encompass. And also I liked the fact that, you know, there were classics departments and there were other kinds of departments. I still loved MIT, but you never know what's going to happen.
I'm just laughing because the story is very similar to my being
I
asked
bet.
to. I said to the search committee for the dean, I'm not interested, but I want to tell you a few things.
Serious mistake.
Yeah.
You sort of raised something which I had been thinking of, and this is the role of the whole late 60s in this whole the student unrest, as I guess you euphemistically call it today. Did that make the role of increasing women students more easier, or did it? I mean, you think of so many things that happened during that time. Europe started, and IAP. A lot of things changed MIT's outlook
Well, IAP
considerably.
led to the Women's Forum. That
Right.
led to all kinds of women's activity.
I think Ken started what he called agenda days,
Oh, yes.
when students could meet, I think usually at lunchtime in the student center, and bring to his agenda topics that they felt needed to be addressed or needed to be talked about, or he would put an end to it right there, which he had a way of doing. But many really useful kinds of things came out of that for discussion with students, with faculty, and with
I think we have to say that students were much more active. I've been at the Institute now for a long time as a faculty member, and that was the one time when the students were most interactive with everybody.
Yes.
And they felt that they were on an equal basis
Right.
with each and every
Yes.
one of us, including the president.
Right.
Yes, yes, even more equal.
In some cases. Right.
And so it was actually a rather good time to make changes. But most of the changes on the women's issues came about with the demise of your office, I think, Emily. I really think that because students felt well, at the time we didn't, my career has certainly been very much like this, and I don't know about the rest of you, but adverse things always happen.
Sure.
And but adverse things often lead to re-examination, and through the re-examination, good things happen.
right.
So I would say that the Women's Forum
Was wonderful.
and the IAP activities and many of the things that we did at that period were directly connected with re-examination, and we were told that the way women's affairs were handled at MIT would be different in the future than they had been in the past. Well, if they're different and everybody's on an equal basis, so we should all get together and talk about
Sure,
it. So that's why we had that study.
Sure.
So that's the 1970 study,
Yeah.
and you have a copy of that. It's
Well,
amazing that you still have a copy of that.
Well, I still have another one too, probably.
Pre-word
I'm not
processor.
sure.
That's history, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
What's the title?
Well, that may not
This
be
is
the one you're
this
talking
may be a
about.
different one.
Yeah.
Well,
1970
this is the
study.
admissions
This
That's
is
a
a
study.
proposal for
Ah.
new policy
Emily's
for
admissions.
admissions.
The one you're talking about
Is a different study.
Yeah, I might have it at home,
Yeah.
but
Somebody has it around. Dottie used to be our archivist
yeah,
during those years.
dug
She used
out
to
all kinds.
do all the records and implementation. She was the only organized person, at least I wasn't organized in this area. I had enough to do keeping my research stuff going.
So the ending of your office, was this a conscious effort to, shall we say, mainstream women's issues?
Oh, I
in
don't
MIT,
know. I
or is
think,
it just...
I think the fact that I decided I should go back and do science kind of led to people thinking about, well, what should be done next?
On the other hand, there was a change of deans that generated that review, so to
and
speak,
Dan
of what we
Neihart,
were doing. Yeah.
Also, we had become really overburdened with the pre-medical advising.
We were doing pre-med at the same time.
It was wonderful to know all those wonderful young folks, but it really...
It was terrific.
Oh,
amount
and
of
then
work.
that was the time when the boom for going into medical school was just burgeoning, and the
Raced.
Harvard MIT
Program was beginning.
Right.
was beginning, and so we just had more than we could handle.
And women started getting interested in medicine
Yes,
at that
yes.
time.
Yes.
Before that time, there were very few.
Yes.
So it was a big thing. But after Emily stepped down, because I'll give you my side of that story.
Okay.
I don't know if it's the same as your side.
I don't know.
But when you stepped down, that was a conscious decision that you made.
Yeah.
But the question was, what
What should
next?
happen?
What should happen next? And the students had one opinion. They thought things were going just beautifully. The way they had been going, they didn't want to see a change. Okay, maybe Emily had enough of this, but there'd be somebody else taking Emily's place. And the new dean, Neihart, his idea was that we wouldn't have another person with the same duties as Emily. He'd made that known to us. And so I was the recipient of many unhappy women students. And Dottie was probably the recipient of many more than I had. But we thought we should have some kind of strategy meeting. And the second thing that we thought we should do is to try to have some alternate methodology to give support to women that felt that they needed additional support. And the first year of IAP just happened coincidentally at exactly the same time as your office
Yes, it was.
disappeared.
It was.
It was identical.
Yes,
and
it
it was
was.
even sort of plus or minus a month.
Yeah, I think so.
It was.
Yeah,
it
I
was,
decided just about that time.
Yes.
So it was amazingly coincidental what
Yeah.
happened. So we put out an ad in that first bulletin for IAP that we would have kind of a workshop activity during that very first IAP as a kind of a support group for women. It was supposed to be students. And so we advertised this in the IAP bulletin. Emily has a copy of the advertisement in her,
No,
in
it's
her
not
file.
the ad. It's the notes taken at women's forum meetings.
Oh, yeah.
IAP 1972. We didn't expect anybody would come.
And this became the Women's Forum.
Yeah,
Yes.
in the Cheney room, at least 75 and maybe up to 100 folk were there.
Well,
That's a lot of
Staff, students.
the place, you couldn't admit another person. It was
Women
standing
faculty.
room, and it was incredibly crowded. They couldn't get in through the doors. And because we made a mistake that we didn't put students, we just put women. And so all kinds of women showed up. And what that told us, yeah, that was a great mistake that we made. That was
That
the
was a
best
real
mistake for
you ever
MIT.
made.
Best mistake. It had great repercussions because we got the message that we needed, as women faculty, we had to take the leadership for women at MIT,
right.
not only women students. And that was a very important observation that we had missed up to that point.
Yeah.
Because there was nobody else that's listened to. There is
Right.
nobody else that's listened to as a faculty member
Yeah, and
here.
I don't think that
And-
if you and I had gone separately to other women faculty, we wouldn't have had the success. First place, we didn't probably know them, the other women faculty particularly well.
Yeah,
But when you were all in this room with all these women, it just was clear.
Well, we had a pretty good inkling about the women faculty, because I remember that from the period that I came until you finished your term of office, we used to meet over in Ashdown House for lunch. Do you remember those lunches?
That's right, we did.
And we had one table, and we would talk
Molly
about
Potter and,
priorities for women at MIT. I remember those very well.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Well, you had a zillion meetings, and I had always very few. So
You have a different,
I
you have a
remember,
better mind than
better
I.
than you do.
Let me go back a bit, because your mistake wasn't quite a mistake. Just before that first forum meeting, it was advertised in the IAP bulletin, and a contingent of women employees came into the office
Talk to you.
and talked to me and said, can we come to this meeting?
Oh, yeah.
We're finding
I remember
things at
saying that.
MIT not as good as they should be for employees as well as maybe students, and can we just come and listen? We won't be disruptive, we'll just, and that's, I think,
Okay.
why, and I said, yes, come.
Sure.
Well, you thought it was
So,
going to be 5 people.
I thought there would be, I thought there'd be 5 or 10 students there, and it turned out to be
Moms,
yeah,
These
they
were administrative staff,
these
secretary,
were,
just
yeah.
across the board.
across the
Everybody.
board. In fact, some on the Building 5 corridor were the ones who had said, look, there's some issues that we'd like to raise, and we think if we talk with other women, it may be helpful both for us and for other women to see what's going on. So they passed the word, and I think that's how so many women showed up. You can blame that. I blame that on me, but it really was. It was a remarkable meeting.
Well, it was
was
exciting. Just to see.
Well, I would say the whole series of meetings that
Was.
we had
Right.
that month
Right.
were very exciting
And then
to
it
me,
continued.
because I got the message of what I had missed all this time and what was necessary. And we have to also point out that Jerry Wiesner was very, very
Mrs.
supportive
Wiesner, yes.
Mrs. Wiesner was there.
of our activities. They
Absolutely.
were really behind us.
Absolutely.
Because I remember this, and I often say this in public, actually, so I might as well own up to this, because I know when it happened, and it happened in conjunction with the Women's Forum, and some proposals that came after that. So that's January of 1970, isn't it? I think
72.
72.
72.
Well, it's
Yeah.
that very first IAP.
Yep.
And I guess the paper that we put together, the very first draft, was not quite up to Jerry's standards. And I owe to him that he took me aside and gave me some counseling on how to do a proposal.
Good.
And I never failed after that. That was the one and only time.
all you needed.
And he was my first and severest mentor on science policy, because that's what I call this whole thing.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's a different part of my career.
Yes.
And what he said was, you have to treat science policy and service at MIT and elsewhere the country in the same way you treat your own research, and you have to have a level of excellence.
Absolutely.
And you have to think through what are the purposes and to fashion any proposal and document that you issue with the same kind of excellence as expected of your MIT scholarly work. And that stayed with me. That was terrific advice.
What a wonderful, wonderful man. And Mrs. Wiesner.
Yeah, she never
the
missed
two
a
of them,
meeting.
She
Yeah.
always came and
She took notes. And
Yeah.
Well, she was so always available for staff work. We
Right.
used to do these studies, and she would take her part along with all the other committee members and call students individually one-on-one. And we used to do telephone quizzes and questionnaires.
That's right. We
Remember?
did a telephone
The-
survey.
There were a
for
couple surveys done.
Yes.
housing and so forth.
Yes.
And she was one of the, I don't know if you know that, but she was one of the members
Callers.
that called the students. And she was one of the very best people that we ever had in doing those calls. She was a terrific staff member.
Exactly during this time, from 71 to 73, work was being done on the women's centennial, the
Oh,
centennial of
yes.
Ellen Swallow.
We're going to change tapes.
Okay.
Good.
Good. Let's,
Take a break.
yeah,
Warm
let's
up
take a
here.
break.
Yeah.
I'm Warren Siemens, former director of the MIT Museum. We're here today to talk about the last 50 years of the women's history at MIT. With me is Roz Williams.
I'm the undergraduate dean of undergraduate education and student affairs since 1995.
I'd like to pick up with the women's centennial in '73. At that point, all these other things seemed to be happening simultaneously. And working with the amateur, we put together an amazing exhibit on the history of women up to that point at the MIT. We lined the corridors in June of '73 with stories of the fascinating and phenomenal things that had been done by women alumni. And were you aware of this from the dean's office? Did this have any effect in the overall thing?
I can remember the students being very impressed with and coming into the office and saying, did we know certain students or did we know? But I also remember the story that some students were very impressed with Florence Luscombe, and they wanted to locate her. So they went, I'm not sure where they started, maybe the alumni office, but eventually found her living in Central Square, and I think a rooming house of some kind.
A commune.
And but they were determined that they wanted to invite her to have dinner with them and talk with her because they thought she had done such interesting things. So they asked a young man at the desk or at the front if Florence Luscombe lived there, and he said yes. And he hollered up the stairs, "Hey, Flossie, there's some girls here who want to talk with you." And she was about 90 years old, I think,
She's
at the time.
class of 1909.
Right,
So this would have
and
been...
she came down the stairs on the double and went and visited with these students and had a marvelous time, and in fact stayed connected to them for quite a long time. But I think the other thing that came out in that display particularly is not just these pictures then, but it made almost a personality out of many of these people that you depicted there. And I think too that Mrs. McCormick comes through as really exceptional woman. I think the fact that she encouraged the birth control research and that she was so active in the suffragette movement. I mean, after all, two things that are important to women were those being able to vote and being able to have some control over their lives. And I think that really left an impression. So whatever, from my perspective at the time, that students came in to talk to me about, those were two people that I think were shown in that particular exhibit, and they came to life for the students through that.
That's right. I mean, Mrs. McCormick, some of the students would see every now and then, but she was just a little lady with a little black hat. And it was hard to believe, that this was the lady that did all these things. And isn't there a marvelous portrait of her
In McCormick, yeah.
There's,
There was.
Hat?
there's one actually
It looks
in...
like Sargent or somebody painted it. I'm not sure he did, but, really, what a lady she was.
There are actually two portraits. There's one in McCormick Hall, but there's a wonderful one over in what I call the President's Auxiliary Office, Catherine Wilmore's office. As you go from the President's office directly across, Catherine has placed...
She was some lady.
Yes.
But I think what I wanted to really is to show the enthusiasm that our students had for getting to know students who'd been here before them and had gone through many of the things perhaps that they'd gone through, and that it really was, they were searching for stories and information about these people. So.
It was an easy way to capsulize the history of women here, in a very effective way. That was just the time I was leaving to go off to Mount Holyoke, so it was kind of just a roundup of...
Well, wasn't there a sort of mixed message then? If your office was closing down and this was perceived as a crisis at the very time that you're celebrating the centennial, it sounds like a very...
Yeah.
Well, the crisis turned all into good things.
But you don't know it at the time of the crisis. It's,
one point we should make about Mrs. McCormick that's really important, I think, for women at MIT. it is often said that admitting women is a negative for fundraising, right? Because women don't have the resources and they're not as good donors as alumni. Now, I heard that a lot in the 60s. And before we had too many women at MIT, one of the arguments against admitting more women was it was going to do something terrible to it was very detrimental to fundraising. But the truth of the matter is that of the alumni up to that point, Catherine McCormick gave more money than anybody else.
To date.
Right.
Still to date?
I think so.
I wonder what were some of the other arguments against increasing the number of women students at MIT? Because now in 1997 it looks like sort of inevitability, right? This is the way history was, of course, marching, but I doubt if it felt that way in the 60s.
I'd take that one on. I think it was a question of capacity to do the work. At the time that I came in, we had a bimodal distribution. We had women students that were truly superb, and then we had another bunch that were not below average, okay? Let's call it that. And on the basis of the admissions process, there was no reason that they should be below average because they were admitted with high capabilities. And I would say certainly people in my department, and you know, we're sort of mainstream MIT. I think that there was disbelief that women could do the work here. They felt that as high school students, when things weren't all that competitive, women were studious and they were motivated and so forth, diligent, they would be fine. But put them in a college environment and all the demands of the MIT undergraduate program, that they didn't have it to make it here. And so the demonstration was that we had women around for 100 years and they were substandard based on their the admissions criteria. So we have to lower the admissions criteria to it to get more women. Right? I mean, that was the whole thing, and then they would flunk out of this place. So I believe that the fundraising was only part of it. The other part was there was disbelief that they could make it here. And I think that on my side of it was that we didn't give we didn't have an experiment. This is after you left, 1974. You weren't here anymore.
That's right.
And I was asked to write a paper for the IEEE Education Journal. And, well, they asked me to write a paper. What to write a paper about? I didn't really know anything about, there was anything particular about educating women in engineering. So I came up with a prediction about critical mass. What was critical mass and why it was important. And so the premise was that women today weren't doing so well in engineering because they were below critical mass, and they didn't have the same educational opportunities. Even though they were admitted to a university, they would be singled out. They'd sit in a seat, and around them were a whole bunch of holes. Yeah, right. You remember how that was when we were teaching. They had one girl in the class, and there was just no other student next to her. It's like poison. Some kind of...
Like a dandelion weed killer.
And when she tried to ask a question, it wasn't taken seriously. We heard that time and time again from the women students, that to participate in class was difficult. And it was difficult because the professor didn't take them seriously, and because their colleagues, the cohorts, the same age, the other students, there was a barrier, and women didn't want to seem stupid, so they didn't want to ask a question that might seem stupid. And you can't learn science if you won't ask a question that was on your mind. It didn't matter if it seemed stupid or not.
Millie,
the most important questions often do seem stupid.
Would you define that critical mass to some degree?
Yes. Well, at that time, my formula for evaluating critical mass was I took the size of a class, which is about 20 students. I don't know if that's the right number, but 15 to 20 students, and I figured that you need more than one woman student in the class. that if there was 0 or 1, then she wouldn't participate in the activities on an equal basis. And it wasn't before there were 2 in the class that there was a chance that she would ask a question. So I use that as the critical mass, and you work that out, simple statistics, that gives you 15%. And what I have had the pleasure of watching over the years, and as the various departments increase their numbers of women students, and the numbers got up to 15%, there was a change in the performance. And when we got close to 15%, the bimodal distribution that we were so used to when you were in the dean's office disappeared.
Oh, wow.
And the distribution became similar to
Wonderful.
the distribution of all the students. But of course, at the time that I came up with this supposition, we didn't know. And this work is actually often quoted in education of women students, let alone engineers.
This critical mass thing, we have a wonderful photo of 26-100 when it was just became the primary physics lecture hall with 2 women students, one of whom is Sheila Woodnall, by the way,
really?
sitting in this mass of 300 people.
And there were holes around them?
Well, sort of, but I mean, it was so they were all crowded. The professor forced them all forward, so they're not sort of a circle around them, but at least there were 2 white shirts. The rest of them all have coats and ties.
Well, I know my own teaching here in the early years until maybe 1975 or maybe even beyond that. I used to see this circle of empty seats around the women students. I saw that myself.
I'll look at it. I'm sure there probably is in this.
There are two areas that might respond to that question, though, discussions that I remember sitting in on. Emily never went to a meeting without being absolutely so well prepared that that there was no, you had to be, because you just never knew what kind of question was going to come up. So she was always well prepared. And when she presented this report that we just talked about on admission policy to I think it was faculty council, the room was very crowded, and I was sitting in the back row, and I had taken along a woman student with me just for support and because I thought she'd be interested, but I dragged her along. Anyway, there 2 questions came up, and one of them was, if we admit all these women students and they're successful and they graduate from here, what will they do when they leave?
What did I say?
And, and you said, what do the men students do? And a dead silence fell in the room because nobody knows what the men students do either. So I thought there was the only way to answer that question. I mean, we had a lot of data to indicate what the women students do, but our numbers were small. And even though we said, of the 100 in the last class, 80 went to graduate school and so forth, it wasn't really what they were looking for. And so but I thought that was a question, an answer that needed to be said, because I don't think anyone really knows, where all our male students end up and whether they end up using the education that they had. And the other question that came up was of this class size and displacement. If we admit 100 more women students, will we have to reduce the number of male students? And that discussion, there's no answer to it, and you have to look. And I think, in fact, the discussion went on for several years, and I think finally they did increase the class size to 1,000.
But modestly.
But slowly and modestly, yes.
Well, the increase in the numbers of women was small at first.
Yes. Yes.
So that it didn't disturb the balance. But look what's happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the interim.
Yeah.
And it's not a small perturbation anymore.
No.
But I think it probably was a good decision the way it was done. I mean, to do it in that incremental way, so that you weren't.
It was the only way to go, because we didn't know ourselves what would happen.
No.
In all fairness.
That's right.
I'm sure the hidden question, the first question was, aren't the female students going to get married?
That's
and
right.
not
I mean,
use
that's what they were
this
looking for.
Valuable education.
Well, it's worse than that. There were very few career opportunities at that time for women in science and engineering. It was bad enough in universities, but to get a good position was a lot more difficult. But I think that what we could do if we want to know how well they did, is to look back what our graduates have done.
Yes.
And that is the most amazing story. You know, we know about the big successes because they're prominent in the newspapers and they're national leaders. And they were our students, and so many of them.
Yes,
and the
that's
other
right.
thing is that when you go to a professional society and you look at the women speakers
Yes.
that they have and the people that are asking intelligent questions in the audience,
We know who we're doing.
and I look back and I remember this was in the class of this and this
Yeah,
one
right.
was in the class
Right.
of that.
That's right.
And the percentage of people that are making their mark that are our former students is large.
yes.
So, you know, that tells us that we did something right.
Right.
And I would like to mention one other data point is recently we're starting a campaign to raise funds for a new building, CS building, computer science building. And so we go back and look at our alumni. And of course, alumni includes women nowadays. And how many women CEOs and have vice presidents of this and that? The number is staggering. I had no idea that we had so many of our women students as entrepreneurs and running their own businesses and this and that. We could never have predicted that at the time.
Just backing up what Melanie just said, next year is the 125th anniversary of
We ought to
Dawn Swallow's
we should look at some of
graduation.
those statistics.
And-
You wouldn't believe what you see.
But as part of that, we asked the Alumni Association, the Technology Day Committee asked the Alumni Association to pull out a list of all women CEOs and those with a professor or professor in their title. It's a volume that thick. I mean, it's a staggering number of people that are, and this is only those two categories. So I mean, it was just totally unbelievable because it's happened in a sense very gradually, and yet obviously it's very much of a force.
I think it was a surprise to us.
Sure.
If you go back to those pivotal years, and there clearly is a hinge there. I mean, so
Yeah.
something
Yes,
happened. I mean, you've just enumerated a lot of reasons why many people, students, alumni, faculty, might not have wanted to see MIT significantly increase the number of women. So who were the people who wanted to see this happen, or the allies? You've said you didn't feel isolated or alone or particularly embattled. So who you know, how were you helped by people in the MIT administration or faculty or?
Well, I always felt that whoever was the president, from Killian and Stratton through, they always and all the upper administration, they held you to high standards and severe questions. But I never felt that in principle they were against this happening. It was a matter of excellence, quality, you know, doing it right.
I think we were carrying a banner
Yeah.
to do it, but I never felt that we were shut off from.
No,
we
never.
always were allowed to. You know,
Right.
always. I said
I-
you were always invited to.
I think that facts were strongly on our side.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
the admissions take that particular case. We were admitting men and women by different standards. And our faculty thought that was repugnant.
Yes.
We should have the same standards. So they were on our side.
Yeah.
It made it easy.
Who was the director of the head of the committee on admissions from the Aero department? I'm terrible with names today. But I know he called me one day and said, I'd like to try a social experiment and see how we could admit more women and just kind of see how that would work. And so he asked me for some data. And he was really the committee chair at the time. Do you know what I'm talking?
I know
thinking
who
of?
you mean, and I forget his name, and he's still on the faculty
Yes,
now.
he is. Yes, he is.
And if I go through the Aeroastro list, I can easily identify him
It'll
for
come
you.
to me, but he really was. He had this open kind of. He had heard some facts. He wanted to get some more, and he considered this to be a very, as I said, social experiment that he wanted, an engineering experiment almost. He set it up that way, and I think was one of those, as you asked about allies, I think I always considered him to be
He was
as one
proactive on our
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah.
There were a number of people that were proactive. And
Well, the other thing about the MIT faculty is that you know, with so many, I don't mean to slam the humanities people, but most of the faculty are
Fact-oriented,
evidence
yes,
oriented.
yes.
And if you can say, look at it yourself. What conclusion do you come to? They look at data and
we were very careful about our reports.
yes.
Our reports have lots of statistics, lots of data.
Yeah.
We were fortunate that you two, you know, one a scientist, one an engineer, could speak the same language, and
We spoke the same language as the men.
that's right.
Yeah,
but there was not a whole lot of social kind of stuff
No.
in it. You know, there
No,
was
there
never
wasn't.
there was never a whole lot of how many
No, it
students
wasn't
came in
that.
for counseling and how
No.
many came in for, you know, this problem or that.
No, it was
always
education.
it was always educationally based. Yes.
I think it's
Yeah.
proper to point out these two trailblazers here. We have Emily, who was the first person who sort of came up through the ranks to gain tenure at the MIT,
Yeah.
and the first person to be appointed professor in the entire School of Engineering. So we have two.
First tenured member.
So that's-
Actually, Sheila Widnall preceded me, but I got tenure before she did.
Yeah, but she
So-
I came
was
as a
faculty
full
member.
professor.
That's right.
So we have.
She came through the ranks.
I think that says a lot in the sense that these were then the people who pushed the whole ball further
Well,
and opened the door.
We were part of the whole culture.
Well, they had
And
had
liked-
credibility.
liked the
and-
place and
Yeah.
you know, enjoyed the environment and were stimulated by all the intellectual activity and fun as well.
Yeah, we like the competition.
Yeah.
and the
Challenge.
and the intensity of the place.
Oh, yes.
I always thought that was a great thing about
Yeah.
MIT.
But that's what it took. Any lesser people, group would not have been
Well,
able to.
we did the same thing with the women that we did with the guys. Academic excellence and leadership. I think these are the two things that we emphasized, and I'd say we did rather well. I think that we got leadership in our women, which was very
Yes.
difficult.
Yes. Yes.
I mean,
That's
to do
right.
academic excellence was relatively easy because they were expecting that when they came here. But leadership is not something they were expecting to do when they came here, but they left with it one way or another.
I think we could mention a few of those people. We talked earlier about, not during one of these sessions, but about Maria Kiveseld and Scotty Margaret McVicker. It'd be nice to get some recollections of those
Dottie,
people.
you tell about them because you knew them best when they were undergrads.
You spent the most time with
Well,
them in
you
a
know,
way.
enough time with them. I think of Paula Stone, who
Yes.
I
Paula
knew very
Stone,
well.
oh,
She
yes,
was
I
of civil
worked with her a lot.
engineering, and you know, she lived in senior house, and I would go over and eat lunch with her. And in her room, well, that was co-ed living, and I got to see, you know, co-ed living in its
Reality.
reality. Right.
Somewhat messy reality.
Harsh history.
Right. But you know, received her PhD and went on to, as a matter of fact, I think outstanding water resource. In Washington, I believe she is now. I have a Christmas card from her now and then. But Margaret McVicker, of course, who started out being quite social and sailing and doing all the fun things, and then sort of said, you know, hey, there's a lot more here to be done, and just went ahead and did it.
Let's go into a little bit of her career. I think that's interesting because of her long-term, however shortened, career here.
Yeah. Well, as I say, she started out being, you know, active in sailing and doing all the things that that first-year women students were doing at the time, and then all of a sudden, the whole world opened up for her. This was a place where she could be Margaret McVicker and not play a role that I think she was concerned about when she first came. So she did. I mean, she just got into her academics, and she got into opening up connections, where Europe is a good example, where she felt that there was just so much to be learned if you could connect up with a lab and work there and be part of what was going on. She was president of the dormitory when it first opened, when McCormick first opened, and I remember her coming into the office and asking me to read her acceptance speech from Mrs. McCormick, which was it was hard to believe that you know, that a student had written this. It was just so right to the point how important it was for the women students to have this dormitory, how much it meant to them. And then, of course, she went on to to do graduate work and on to Cambridge. I always remember her, to show what kind of a person she was. She told me the story about going to Cambridge and how when she came back, she told me the story that while she was there, you remember Margaret kind of swung along and went anywhere she wanted to and did most anything she really wanted to learn about. But she walked across the lawn at Cambridge, a lawn which people were not supposed to walk across, at least students weren't supposed to walk across. And she didn't know that. So she went, she was called to her tutor's office to explain why she walked across this particular part of the green. So she said, well, she had to get from one place to the other. I mean, that was the shortest way, and that's the way she went. And she was told that that was not the way to go and that students weren't allowed to do that. So she decided that she should call students together and stop this nonsense about where you could walk on the Cambridge campus. However, I have a feeling that it was not successful, that in fact, when she left Cambridge, students were still not allowed to walk across that lawn. But it was very typical of the way Margaret, if there was something that she didn't see any purpose for doing, then it ought to be challenged, and she did that.
Well, she was a product of the late 60s and Vietnam era and everything, and students were just questioning authority.
Yeah.
She was part of that era, and that was one of her great strengths.
That's right, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
She was class of 65, and, but Europe started early 70s. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
very
but
short
that was
time.
after she came back.
Right, I know, but
Yeah.
it's still amazingly short time.
Amazing,
I think,
that's
for
right.
her to
When
get
she had something to do, she set about doing it.
She's very methodical
Right.
and organized.
And she knew people. I mean,
Well, she marched into Paul Gray's office when Paul was in the dean's office
Yeah.
and said, I want to do this. And she had it all laid out, and you know, what could he say?
yeah, because when I was in the dean's office, Paul Gray was the dean for the freshman class, so he was all part of the dean of students team.
Yeah.
And
Margaret was totally fearless.
Yes.
yes,
And she was appreciated much more so in later life and much more so on the outside than the inside. It took a long time before the MIT community appreciated
That's right.
her.
That's right.
And the people that were closest to her in her department gave her the most trouble.
Yes.
And their expectations of an academic was research and teaching. And Margaret was a leader. That was her focus.
Walter Rosenblith was really very fond of Margaret and, in fact, understood.
But he was another visionary.
That's right, exactly.
And he
He's the
was
same
sort
kind
of
person.
he's sort of cut out of the same cloth as
You know,
that.
he understood her, and he, you know, could see what she was trying to accomplish. So,
But her colleagues that were close to her had much more difficulty in seeing the big picture about her.
yes.
Well, she's a real bridge figure because there are certainly people in the dean's office today who worked with her closely and revere her, and
yes.
you know, she really kind of connects that era with the present.
Well, she's the one that did Europe, not only at MIT, but the whole country.
Right.
Yes.
This is where
Yes.
it all started.
Yeah.
And we're thankful that it started here
Absolutely.
because it's always worked the best here.
Yeah.
And we have a
We're
few
made for it.
competitors
Yeah.
here and there, but
But it didn't matter where Margaret's office was or any of the what she called trivial things. The point was to get to the goal that she had set to accomplish. And none of these other things were important. And I've often admired her for being able to do that. You know, she just cut away all the things
Yeah.
that didn't need to
But
be.
it doesn't make for an easy life.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
Certainly did in her
doesn't-
Yeah.
case.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Exactly. But I'm trying to. We've had many other outstanding women.
We talked about Shirley Jackson a bit
Yes,
earlier.
Shirley, yes.
Another one who you would have known in those early days. Must have been fascinating to meet that person as an undergraduate here.
yeah, I guess you knew her better than I did as an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate,
She
yes.
she took a few courses with me, so I had the pleasure of teaching her. And I think you had much more social interaction with her.
During her
at that
undergraduate years,
She
yeah.
dropped in to see you
Almost every
often,
day,
just
yeah.
about every day.
Yeah.
Part of the luck of the office was it was sort of on the natural pathway from McCormick to wherever you were going. You just came in the side, building.
Where was
It's just down the hall from
5106.
Yeah,
Okay.
5106.
it? Okay.
So they could just duck in the naval architecture doorway where the anchors are and walk down the hall and talk.
That was a perfect location.
It
Yeah.
was.
After
It was, and there were times when you'd see someone go by with their head down, clearly unhappy, and you could run out and walk the rest of the way with them, and
When did Shirley graduate? What's her
Uh,
era?
Well, she and Margaret were about the same, whatever
I think
year
they
that
must have
was.
been in the same. Well, I guess Margaret might have been a year or two
Ahead.
ahead of her. Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes,
I,
yes.
I think she was about the same time as Aviva Brescher.
Yes, yes.
And they were great friends. They were both in physics.
Yes.
And they were good supportive for each other.
Yes. Yes.
Were the women
And
students?
so that would be about 19. When I first came, they both took classes from me. And I think Aviva was still an undergraduate. She must have been about a senior. And she was taking graduate courses. And she was terrific.
Yeah, outstanding.
And a lot of leadership.
Yes.
And I don't know whether we could say, Shirley came in to celebrate when she really passed, she really hit some big exam. I don't know whether it was physics or math, but she came in to celebrate and lit up a cigar.
Those were the days.
We all kind of sat around on the couch and
There were times, for instance, when a faculty member would call and said, I have a woman student who can't take an exam. Tension is too great in this room with all the, maybe was the only woman student in the class. Usually that was the case.
I had one like that.
And I would say, with your permission, can she take the exam in my office? And so that often happened. We had a little office that wasn't used much. Or maybe some days Emily wasn't going to be in the office, she'd be in the department.
Right.
And I would say, with your permission, she can take the exam here, and that often happened. A faculty member would bring the faculty, and I'd proctor it, so to speak.
yeah.
They'd sit in the inner office and take the exam, and there were, I think, times when that helped.
Was it the female student who was was it the men who didn't want to, who were the source of the tension, or the woman student? I don't quite understand where the
Yeah, I'm
request
not
came
sure.
from.
I think it was at the time the student might have just been feeling the pressure.
Yeah,
I don't think that
Did
it
the
was.
women students do a lot of support for each other? Was
Yes,
it very tight?
tremendous. That was unbelievable. And
Definitely.
they still do.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed. It's been our
Definitely.
tradition.
Yes. Yes.
Shirley Jackson was an unusual case because she was the oldest, or the most senior, I think, of the black students here in physics, or close to the most senior. And she organized the younger ones under her, and she did the mentoring and the tutoring, and she got a whole cadre, a whole generation of black students through. They wouldn't have passed without her. And they look up to her like almost like a demigod.
Yes.
She has a real special place in our history.
oh, she does.
Definitely. Yeah.
Still, I mean, it's still going on. I feel good when I think of Sheila Widnall there running the Air Force, and
I do
Shirley
too.
Jackson, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I know, jeepers, there are some honest people that have good heads. And
Finally, we're in safer hands.
Yes,
we're
yes.
in safer
Yes,
hands.
yes.
Like, I
Good
think
technical
when,
skills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
when
And also good problem solving
absolutely,
skills.
human,
I mean,
sense.
knowing
Humane
both
people.
sides of it,
Yeah.
the technical side and
Yeah.
the people's side. There aren't too many people that can do that.
Yeah, when Vera Kostiakowski was on the faculty, and she had gone to Mount Holyoke. She was the class behind me. And when we were undergrads, her father would come to visit. He was good friends with the faculty at Mount Holyoke. And that was all the time when Los Alamos and and all that was going on. And when he died, I felt the world was not quite as safe. Maybe I was wrong, but I mean, it was another person that you felt,
Tremendous
you trusted
integrity.
the integrity.
Yes. Yes.
Did Sheila play an important role here in,
Oh,
in
very
either
much so.
opening up admissions or with the women faculty? Or?
She wasn't so much into the admissions thing. She came, her contributions were many others, but it wasn't so much admissions. The athletics program
That's correct.
was one area that we owe a tremendous amount to her. Equal opportunities overall was something that she did.
Along that line.
And in the early days, she was our institute problem solver. When there was something that, a faculty issue, this is not women's issue, but just across the board.
Human issue.
A human issue. And I think some of that experience came from the work that she did with the women students. And she was really outstanding. Now, the fact is that we don't know about each other's contributions so well, because after you left, Emily, the two of us, Sheila and I, divided many of the responsibilities.
did.
And this was we did this purposely, so that if she was doing something, I wouldn't do it. I had total confidence that she would do a tremendous job. So, and likewise, if I did something, she didn't do it.
Right.
And so, therefore, I don't know as well
What was going on
was
as well.
on her plate. But one thing that we did do, that there were two things that we did that I think is important for the history. One of them has to do with our Carnegie grant, and the other one is the faculty tenure review. And I think you wanted to hear about
Yes,
both
yeah.
of these, and they're somewhat connected. So Dottie worked very hard on the Carnegie project, and so I'm sure you can contribute much where I leave off.
Okay.
But in 1973, all of a sudden we got a bunch of money to, and it was there were some ground rules about what we were supposed to use this money for. And maybe Dottie can tell you better than I can what it was supposed to be used for. But when we had the money, we decided that we would use it for things that would have some impact. So we did sort of most everything against the rules. But we well, I remember that the rules basically was that faculty would take pay some of their salary, and we would do some kind of scholarly studies. And for most of us, we decided that it was most important for us to be in the classroom. For most of the students that I ever taught, I was the only female faculty they would ever see. And to keep me out of the classroom was the worst thing that Carnegie could ever do for MIT. So, and this was true of the others. So we just did our own thing, and we didn't pay very much attention. And hopefully the Carnegie, I'm not sure exactly about the report, but we maybe should go back to David Hamburg, who's still around, would appreciate the effect of this grant on MIT, because it really had a lot of things. So some of the things I worked on was we set up a course, a subject, what is engineering? And I want to give you the bottom line of that. At the time we started, this was 1973 approximately, women were in selected fields, but they were not in the engineering school by and large, very, very few, and they weren't doing too well. And we thought that we should use resources that we had to get a better distribution of women through the different departments at MIT. So we set up this course, and we thought we would have like about 10 or 15 students, and we would work on Heath kits and get them more comfortable with engineering things when they were freshmen, so that they would be comfortable in going on to the sophomore, et cetera, courses. because freshman is sort of a common curriculum. So this was kind of what the idea was. So in the freshman year, we set this course, and I did it one semester and Sheila did it the other. We alternated. And we did this about 3 years. And first time was offered, we had about 10 or 12 students, which is the next second semester we had 100. And it went up from there. And we had a huge fraction of the women students and even huger fraction of the minority students. Just about all the minority students would take this course. And so they would have as role models, Sheila and myself, when we do some of the classes. And then we got all the great people at MIT who would come in and give us guest lectures. Doc Draper and Edgerton, and all the great people. Yeah. They would tell us about their career, and those are just marvelous stories. And this had a big impact in the enrollments, because the people that came, they decided all of a sudden that they could do it too. That was the message of the course, that if you were admitted to MIT, you could get a degree in almost any department. Certainly, there were many options for you in the engineering school. So, so that led to many very good careers. Another thing that we set up from that was a faculty group, faculty luncheon group. It probably had a name, but I can't remember exactly what the name was. And we met approximately once a month, talking about issues for women students, graduate students, faculty, etc. And we provided lunch, so that was what the grant provided. I'm not sure that was supposed to be, but it was.
I punched it in the tape.
It was important in getting our women, keeping the attendance up. And then once the usefulness of these meetings was established, the attendance was quite good. And one of the activities we had to do with how to get tenure at MIT. And what we discovered from these monthly meetings is that the women faculty got almost no information from their colleagues about what it took to get tenure in their departments. And that most of the people in the departments were obviously men, and they didn't feel all that comfortable in discussing these kinds of issues with women. So if they weren't doing so well, they wouldn't be told, and then pretty soon the tenure clock came around and they wouldn't make it. So we thought of ways to improve the information, the fact sharing, information sharing, and we developed a technique of, we had a sort of Mutt and Jeff type show, and we took Sheila Widnall's resume, and she was the candidate. We did a little play, and she was the candidate that came up for tenure every time we ran this program. and I was the department head. And I had been a department head that time, so I knew what the issues were. And Sheila had received tenure. So we knew that this was a proven case. So then we went through the resume, and we kept the resume at the time she got tenure. So we could look to see what counted. And we went through each of the things, publications, grants, students, teaching, et cetera, letters of recommendation. We went through all the different things and how one prepares one's career to have a better shot at tenure, and also the message that if you did the right things to get tenure at MIT, you were doing the right things for your career, that these were one and the same thing. And we had sessions on how to get grant proposals through and all of these kinds of useful things.
What years did these start approximately?
Carnegie, 1973, and we did them for 10 years.
Did we really? I didn't
Yes, we
realize it
did
was
for
that
10
long.
years, because all the years through the time I was head of the Material Center, I was chairing this and staffing, and in the beginning you staffed it and did the work to get it, the whole thing,
Get it going.
because there was a lot of staff work that was necessary, notices sent out and reserving rooms and reserving meals and all of this sort of nonsense to
To put
get
in perspective, how many were there in that sort of tenure track? say in 73?
Well, the numbers increased a great deal around 1970 in the early years because Wiesner had he was original proponent of affirmative action before it was ever
Yes.
recognized or had a name or a concept
Now,
or
he-
anything.
he we're talking about.
I'm talking about Jerry Wiesner. He had it up in here.
Yep.
And he decided that he said that the women faculty that we had a very large impact on the place. And he said that we needed more of you, that you people were just totally overloaded. You've heard him say that.
Sure.
You remember that still.
Yep.
And he said that we needed more people to help him to improve the quality of life of all the students, because he thought we had contributed not only to the women students, but to all the students.
Yes, he did.
So there was a sort of a hidden campaign, and about 1974 there was some kind of committee that was appointed to try to improve the recruitment of women faculty. I don't know how well it worked, but whatever means, the number increased, but the mentoring was terrible in those years. So our faculty group mentored. That was we were a support group basically, and we were across the whole institute. And obviously the requirements in the engineering school are a little bit different than humanities. I mean, I won't argue that, but there were some irreducible principles, and the process was mainly the same.
Yes.
It's an MIT process, so we explain all of that.
I remember attending a year of luncheons when I first came to MIT, so that was in the early 80s, and I remember that quite well, and they were quite well attended.
Yes, they were well attended, yes.
Yeah, well, it had some impact in increasing the probability of tenure, and toward the last few years, when I thought it was time that I could bow out of this, because it was quite a bit of work, the probability of women getting tenure, in proportion to the number that we had in the pipeline, was equal to that of men.
Yeah.
And when that happened, I felt we were doing okay.
You've done it, yeah.
We've done it, right. right.
It also, though, gave you an opportunity to meet faculty in other departments
yes.
and schools,
That's
and
right.
That's hard
that's
to do.
difficult to do.
Yeah, and I remember we used to take on projects like looking at the undergraduate curriculum and this and that, and what the effect of pass-fail was, and we would talk about institute-wide issues because we were a small enough group that we could focus on things, and I believe that was appreciated by all the faculty.
I think probably.
No, the Carnegie grant, we did a lot of things with it, and it was originally, as you said, set up in a certain way, and we decided that was not the way that MIT ought to do it. And other schools that received these grants
There were
had
6 schools. I
had
think,
identified
I guess.
an office and hired a person to sit there and to administer, and we decided that was probably not the thing to do here, that we should spread it around and do some faculty, some students, some variety of kinds of things. So we did have some student interns who worked on projects with women faculty, which was also a wonderful way to get students who are interested in physics, for instance, worked with Vera on a project, and I think Millie and Sheila's course. There were a variety of things that we did with those funds, which spread them. They reached far more people than they would have had we set up an office and just directed them in some sort of administrative way. But we just sort of flew in directions, and I think all of them. I think it was a useful.
Well, one of our proteges, I'm not sure if she was exactly in the original Carnegie, but she came a few years later. But I set up sometime in the 70s a lab at one of the dorms at McCormick. Do you remember that, Dottie?
Yes.
That was Denise Denton,
Yes.
and there was another young lady, I've forgotten her name. And Denise became a very, very young dean of engineering at the very large engineering school, University of Washington, age 36.
Oh my goodness.
Can you imagine that? And what she learned as an undergraduate to begin with, and then as a graduate student, was really quite amazing, because she was working with students as an instructor when she was still an undergraduate, setting up this lab course. and they ran it themselves. It was very effective. And then that training allowed her, when she was a graduate student, to help out with some teaching at one of the neighboring colleges here. So by the time she graduated, she had all this teaching skill and documentation. So it made it easy for her to get a faculty position. And then she got tenure. And then from that went to the Dean's job.
At 36.
Yeah.
36. We really have an amazing group of students.
A group of women students.
Yeah,
That's
and she's
why
another case that's a little bit like Margaret McVicker, where people judged her just on her engineering achievement, but that wasn't the whole person.
Yeah.
The whole person was all the things she was
Yes.
doing.
Yeah. That's why I brought up previously that I would have
Leadership
loved to
is so
see some
much-
more of those people here on the faculty. It would have been wonderful to be able to keep more of them, which, you know, we just haven't
Well,
done.
we've kept quite a few of them, and what I'd like to say, I'd say it differently, Dottie, that as I go around the country, you know, and
Yeah, you
here and
see-
I
there,
know, and
I
see
see
them.
them everywhere.
I
I mean,
Missionaries.
yeah,
know, that's
they're
true.
missionaries,
Yeah.
and I believe that the leadership that they brought with them to their institutions was kind of unique because they weren't used to women with so much independence and,
Yeah.
and knowing where they're going.
That's right.
And
Well, I appreciate that because I guess I just miss them.
I guess we need both.
Right.
But many of them are on our faculty. If you look at the, especially in the engineering school, you look where they come from. We have quite a few of our own.
Let me go back to Sheila for a minute. I was the first woman to be on the athletic committee, and it was a time when we were just trying to get facilities that was available and get what do you call them? Intramurals moved into the what do you call the
I mean, women in an
women
intramural
into yeah,
system.
well, we were
into
trying to get them
Some teams.
into some other into teams to be competitive with other
Uh-huh.
schools and so forth. It was a really difficult task at the time, but I was on the committee and was able to. We had some supportive faculty members on the committee, but there was a time when that wasn't working very well, and the woman they hired as the athletic director was just terrific as far as being an entrepreneur and getting women excited and onto programs and so forth. But she had crossed some of the male staff members over there, and so it looked like she was going to leave. In any case, I couldn't take on the job because I was on the committee, and it would look like I was playing too bad. So I asked Sheila if she would look at that. Well, it's all she needed. You know, she just jumped right in and got a group together of students who were participating in all the different sports. And we came up with another report, which I can't give you the date, but it certainly is worth reviewing.
About 1977, I
Was it?
think.
Yeah, I know it was.
That would be about the time.
Yeah.
It would have been on equity and athletics.
That's
or-
right. That's
Yeah.
right.
We had it in the 1972 report where
You did.
Paula Stone and were the co-chairman. We had a section on athletics, but that was sort of preceded.
That's right.
That was the year of Title IX.
That's
Because we're
right.
just celebrating
Yes,
the 25th
Yes,
anniversary.
yes, we did.
Yeah.
We did. We've never really struggled with Title IX.
Correct.
I think we've
ahead of
always
the-
been
ahead of
able
the
to.
trend.
Yes,
Yeah,
we
been
were
ahead.
always headed off, and but the sports programs weren't equal in the sense that some of the students felt that we weren't teaching those courses as well as we could have. But Sheila's report, I think, settled it. It's never been an issue since. I mean, she addressed all the right issues. She got all the right people to jump in, and we met several times, I remember, at McCormick.
That was a model report.
And it was an excellent report. And it's
I
something
thought
that
we
should
did a
be-
whole bunch of great reports.
Well, that's
and
true.
That
was one that was, yeah.
And each of them had an impact. Amazing, you know. After that, when I started doing things for the federal government, you know, and our National Research Council and so forth, I thought that all the reports should have equal impact. it was hard to beat these MIT
That's right. The
reports that we
reports
did here.
were so very, yeah.
I
you're
really
right.
learned a lot from this.
And I think would be a model report for today. That kind of. But it's intercollegiate sports that I was trying to get at, because there was a lack of other teams to play because we weren't in the various sports programs, and we needed someone to get us into them. And the woman who was here at the time was not in that kind of position. So we did hire then Jane Betts, who came and I think just recently left, but was just great. I mean, she just knew her way around the sports world, which none of us did. But Sheila was really the person who made that go, made that work.
And she also made work on better facilities
Yes.
and locker rooms,
Yes,
and
yes. Yes.
and I know I remember even the principal, equal tuition, equal treatment.
She
Equal
missed
lockers.
when she missed her little she had a daughter Anne, and one day we were at a meeting and we were really making good progress and everything was coming together, and she looked at her watch and she said, "I've just missed Anne," who was her daughter's soccer game, "and I have to get out of here to go see that soccer." So we knew she was encouraging Anne to participate in soccer.
You know, the one thing, good reports have been written here,
Yes.
but they didn't go to just a sort of faceless bureaucracy. There were people up there that were reading the reports
They cared about the
and
report.
listening, and if it hadn't been a good report, probably nothing would have happened. But you do need.
We had our first bad report back in 1972 or something, when Jerry Wiesner taught us how to do reports.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
We didn't repeat our mistakes. After all, we do learn.
From your perspective now, which is, we have to agree, is a unique perspective collectively here, what does the next 50 years mean for women at MIT?
I wouldn't hazard a guess. Good things probably, and struggles, but challenges.
Yeah.
But that's life, and that's all educational institutions are up against real challenges, and so are the students who go to them,
And the faculty teach there.
and the faculty. It's a very, very, very important cause, and it's got to stay high quality. But it's hard to predict how it's going to turn out. But I have my faith that people that work hard and have good brains, something will come of it.
I still work with the Women's Independent Living Group as an advisor, and I'm always very impressed when I go there how much in stride they take things that maybe some years ago were not taken in stride. I think these things are, they deal with things, and they don't feel that they have to run for help for everything. They feel they can deal with it as a group, and
Very capable
and they're
and-
very capable of managing their own affairs and taking
Their
taking charge.
expectations are similar to the men, and we
Yes.
didn't have that 25
That's
years
right.
ago.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think the fact that there are alumni of that group, that they invite back every year, and I just went to their banquet, which was very impressive. People who said, how much they loved being at MIT, how much it had meant to them in their careers, and living there had been. It's a real tribute to what's happened here. I think that's a good message.
I guess one challenge is to get the faculty and graduate students more in sync with the undergraduate experience here, because there still is a disparity, just in sheer numbers,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
the critical mass is a very different critical mass in each of those layers.
Yeah, and
That will come with time.
Yes, well,
You know,
It should.
We have to look and see where the graduate students are coming from. And within
Yeah.
our own place, we're 40-some% women, right, for the undergraduates. You know
Correct.
the numbers better
Right.
than I do.
that's right.
But we only accept a small number of our own students to the graduate program. And when you look around the rest of the country or the world, the percentage of women in these various fields that we specialize in here is a smaller number than our own undergraduate population. So we cannot not expect that the numbers would be the same.
Right.
So we'll have to wait a while for
That's
that to
that's where 50 years will make a
happen.
difference. Or
Yeah, right.
And likewise for faculty ranks, I think it's the same thing. And we should just continue to advocate some measure of affirmative action as we have, and it seems to work because we have enough women out there that when they come, they participate in the mainstream, and by and large, they do just as well as the men do. And it's a matter of time. It's not easy being a faculty member here.
Oh,
The
no.
demands are great. And,
Oh, yes.
And this has nothing to do with the Institute and regulations,
Right.
but the pace here is intense, and it's hard to do combine family life and try to have international career.
Right.
It's really hard to do that, and the problem is that it all hits you at the same age group. 25 to 35 is the critical time for all of us, and we don't have the answer to that one.
No.
And it's not an MIT.
No, it's a worldwide
problem. It hits us the most because we're so intense here.
Yeah.
Makes it more difficult.